everybody. Welcome back to Ideal 22. Going to do a quick check and make sure that we have folks coming into the session. There we go. Yes, very nice. Thanks again for registering for our Inclusion, Diversity, Equity, and Accessibility for Learning conference. It's been great so far this week. Today's the third day, and Monday and Tuesday were absolutely fantastic. And I know that today with Erin Huffman-Richard, we're going to continue the trend of just having incredible sessions all week for this event. I don't have a bio or an intro for Erin. Neglected to put that together, but I do want to tell you how I met Erin. I met Erin through Vanessa Alzadi at Anchor Training. Vanessa is somebody that frequently supports TLDC and the things that we do here. And it was absolutely marvelous that she connected Erin with us, and for Erin to be able to come in and speak on her session today. Let's see here. I had the title right in front of me, and of course, I just moved Social Identities Impact on the Learner. So everybody, please help me welcome Erin to our event. And with that, I'll go ahead and hide myself and let you take it away, Erin.
Perfect. Well, thank you all for joining us this morning, afternoon, or evening, wherever you may be from. So we said, I'm Erin Huffman-Richard, and I'm a leadership and learning experience designer, and I use she, her pronouns. I've been doing instructional design for a while now, and most recently was in the higher ed space. So I want to kick us off with a visual description before we dive in. So I am short. I'm a short white woman with brown hair, and I have on a tan sweater today. Behind me is a bookshelf that is filled with lots of books, as well as some artwork my kids have made over the years, and a few family photos. So thank you all so much for being here. I think this is such an important and critical conversation, and I've been able to participate in the conversation the past 2 days, and I'm really glad to be able to join in this meaningful work that we all are doing. So let me go ahead, share my screen. All right, let's get started. And please, I love the chat that we've been using throughout. So please chime in throughout the chat. Really want this to feel like a conversation today. So what are we hoping to do? What I'm hoping to do today is really discuss what our social identities, define what those look like, and help us make sense of what our own identities are. And then we're going to connect that to the unconscious bias conversation. Bridget did such a wonderful job yesterday, really discussing unconscious bias. And we're going to link those two concepts together with social identities. And then we're going to talk about the impact. What is the impact of our social identities and our unconscious bias on the learner? And then we're going to close out with, like, why is this important for our work? Why is this important for learning and development? So to guide our conversation and to really ground our conversation today, I like to begin all of these types of conversations when we're talking about identities with ground rules. And so I would ask that we really approach this conversation from a place of curiosity, right? Be curious when you hear someone else and when you hear what someone else says. If someone says something that challenges your thinking or makes you uncomfortable, be curious, listen. This is often right where growth occurs. Growth often occurs in the space between knowing and not knowing. That is often where the growth occurs. And finally, I would ask that we approach this conversation from a place of empathy. Empathy is different than sympathy, right? So empathy means believing someone else and their experience. So when someone shares a story or shares an example today, honor that, believe their story, lean into that, be curious. And if you're uncomfortable, lean in more and see what we can learn from that. So if these ground rules sound aligned with you all today, I already see some of you doing it. Awesome. Please give us the thumbs up emoji if this works for you. All right, so what are social identities? So a social identity is really who you are in relation to others. So it's who I am in relation to another group of people. Social identities can be visible or they can be invisible. It may be something you're able to tell about somebody or something that you don't know until somebody shares with you that part of who they are. It's also important to note social identities can change over time. They are not necessarily static. And finally, our social identities influence how we see the world. It is the lenses with which we view the world. It is how our experiences in the world, and it's also how others see us. They see us through the social identities lens. And so we'll talk about in a little bit our social identities as a result, and actually, I believe, show up in the training that we create. So, with that, let's look at what are some examples of social identities. So, what I have for you on the screen are examples of social identities. Two words of caution about this list. One is this is not an inclusive list. This is some social identities, and then the examples that are listed for each social identity. This is just some examples. This is by far not an inclusive list of all possible social identities. Also, this list is really US centric, right? This is really based around the United States. This may look different if we were somewhere else in the world in a different country. So I'm going to kind of highlight some of these social identities. And as we're doing this, I want you to think about what in each of these categories, how do you identify? What is the identity that you would name for yourself in these various groups? So let's start off with ability. This is where someone may be able-bodied or temporarily disabled. This is where neurodivergence would show up as within this identity group. So, and this is also an example of an identity that can change over time. So, for example, I have an uncle who in his 40s had a seizure and we found out as a result he had a brain tumor, and when he had a surgery to remove the brain tumor, he became partially paralyzed and he used a cane or a wheelchair for the remainder of his life. And so prior to that disability, to him using a cane or a wheelchair, he was able to navigate the world from a way that he never thought about his ability. And once he started using a wheelchair, he then had to start, and as a family, had to start thinking about, could he go to this restaurant? Was there a way for him to access this restaurant? And what we often found is there wasn't, right? He would often have to enter the restaurant through a kitchen, through the back door, through a kitchen in order to access that space. And so that's an example of where an identity can change. And then when your identity is perhaps part of a marginalized group, you become more aware of it. We also have age, right? This is an example of obviously something, an identity that can change over time. Body size, right? Average, tall, thin, fat, short, different ways that you may identify your citizenship. Are you a U.S. citizen? Are you an immigrant? What does that look like for you? Social class. Social class and education are identities that are really salient for me, given my experience and my background. I grew up in rural Southeast Ohio in what is considered Appalachia. And as a result, I grew up in very much a working class community. And because of those experiences, I cannot unsee class. The way I navigate the world, the way I see the world, class is at the fore of my thinking because of that lived experience that I had. So, for example, when I went to college, individuals were talking about who I was in college with taking AP classes or honors classes in high school. I didn't even know what they were talking about. My high school did not offer such a thing. I had never heard of that before. And so that's an example of where really where social class became really evident to me in my experiences. Family structure. This can look a lot of different ways, and is a way in which individuals can experience the world. Let's see here. What's next on our list? Gender, right? Gender is something that you don't know just by looking at somebody. It can be an invisible identity, something that can change over time. We have language. What languages do you speak, and how does that impact how you experience the world? Your national origin, race. Race is a great example of where some individuals, particularly I would say individuals who are white, often have not thought about their race before. This isn't something that has been they've had to think about if they live in the United States, because it is the United States, the systems have been set up for individuals who are white. So, for example, when I was a kid and I went to the store, I could easily find a doll, an action figure, a book with individuals who look like me. I did not even recognize that I had a race until much later in life, until I began these conversations. Religion is another example of a social identity, and really impacts how someone experiences the world. So, for example, I think about religion in the workplace a lot. So, if you are Christian, the workplace is often set up with our holiday schedules around the holidays that work for that are often closed, and you don't have to work on a holiday, on a religious holiday that you celebrate. Now, I recognize that is not for every job, but for some jobs, that is the case, that you don't have to work Christmas Day, the office is closed. However, for someone else who doesn't celebrate Christianity and they celebrate a different religion, they may have to use vacation days in order to celebrate their holiday. Or someone who celebrates Christmas, I've never had to use a vacation day for Christmas Day. It has automatically been a day I have been given off. And what's even more problematic about that is how this system has been set up, is the fact that then if I take a vacation day in order to celebrate a religious holiday that my company doesn't give up, important meetings may be scheduled then, and then I'm left out of conversations because of that. And then sexual orientation. It's the last identity that we have on the list. And this, again, is one that is not always visible. So, as you look at this list of social identities, I would love for you to kind of put into the chat what was this experience like for you naming what your identities are? Was it easy to name your identity for each of these categories? Was it difficult to name what your identity was for some of these? Were there some identities that you hadn't considered much before, or are there some identities that are really salient for you, right? These are identities that are really how you see the world and how you experience the world. They're at the fore of your thoughts every day. So I'd love if you could respond in the chat, and let's create a conversation around your identities and how you see and experience the world. All right. So sometimes, what I often think about is if it's, often difficult for me to name identities or something I haven't thought about is often for me a place where I know I have had some privilege in the work that I do. And so that can be something that helps me clue into a way in which the world has been, or at least here in the United States, things have been set up for me. See, Bridget, sometimes you struggle with identities. I find that labeling myself as something is ossify my thinking. But I recognize the importance identities have for other people, for sure. Yeah, this is definitely a way in which folks can really experience the world, and can be different ways individuals see the world. So really, I think what's important to note here is these really are the ways in which you see the world. They're really the lenses that we come to the world with. And unfortunately, some of these lenses come with bias. We don't always have, all of us have the same glasses in which we see the world. They come with bias. So yesterday, Bridget did a really wonderful job of, if you were able to be part of that presentation, of talking about unconscious bias. And so unconscious bias is the social stereotypes about groups of people that individuals form outside of their own conscious awareness. So these are things that show up, the biases that you have that you don't even recognize that you have and that you're putting out into the world. So our biases can really be influenced by our background. They can be influenced by our environment, our experiences. We can really be influenced by what we watch on TV, what we read, who we hang out with. All of these pieces really can contribute to our bias. So, for example, a few years ago, I was working with a group of individuals who identify as women. Everyone in the room identified as women, and they were doing an activity where they had descriptors of different individuals. And within these descriptors, they had to decide who was going to be part of a team, like whose skill set made the most sense to be part of a team. One of the descriptors they had said it was for a 36-year-old physician. And so they had this 36-year-old physician. And as they were going through and talking about it, they started describing the 36-year-old physician with the use of the word he. They started giving the 36-year-old physician he pronouns. And as the conversation continued, one of the participants said, wait a second, why are we assuming that the 36-year-old physician is a he? And a couple of the other participants like, because it said it on the list, it said it is a descriptor. And then when they went back and they looked, they said, oh, wait a second. This just says 36-year-old physician. It does not tell us the gender of this individual. It just says they are 36-year-old physician. And this group of women was shocked because they were women, right? They're like, how did we just assume that this person was a man? And we gave him he pronouns. And a couple of the other folks in the room who said, like, I'm actually studying medicine right now, and I even did this. I'm a woman studying medicine, and I even labeled the 36-year-old physician as he. And so I think this is just a classic example of where unconscious bias shows up, right? Because of the experiences that we have had, we have often seen men as doctors. And so that is where our brains unconsciously went. There wasn't a conscious decision to make this 36-year-old doctor a man. So why does this happen so much? I love this phrase, or a phrase coined by the Neuro Leadership Institute. The Neuro Leadership Institute really combines the study of neuroscience and leadership development together. And they say, if you have a brain, you have bias. If you have a brain, you have bias. So the reason we have bias is really because of the work that our brains have to do. So think about this. This is shocking to me. Our brains receive 6,000 thoughts every single day. 6,000 thoughts goes through our brain every single day. So in order for our brains to process this amount of information, it has to be efficient. It needs to process information efficiently. Therefore, a lot of the times our brain does it unconsciously in order to be efficient, in order to deal with the 6,000 thoughts. It does it subconsciously. We're not even aware of these thoughts that are occurring. So 90% of the decisions that we make happen subconsciously, unconsciously, 90%. So think about the things that you're going about the day. 90% of it happens, the decisions you make unconsciously. And so that is why bias shows up, right? Our brain is trying to process all of this information. And so it's doing it against perhaps the stereotypes and the things that we have learned by growing up. And so with that, that's why, back to that example I said of the group of women who labeled the 36-year-old doctor a man, that is truly because they did that unconsciously, right? Like there wasn't intentional thought around that, but that is what happens. That is how much bias shows up. And so I share with this thought around how much our brains process information subconsciously or unconsciously. I share this not to excuse us, like, well, look, everyone has bias, so what's the point? I can't do anything about it. But I share that because that really, to me, tells me the intentional work that we need to do in order to overcome the bias, right? In order to ensure bias doesn't show up in the trainings that we create, right? Like the intentionality that it has to take. So what I want us to do now is really put on our instructional designer or learning and development hats. And what I have in front of you is an example of something from a training. So let's just say you were given the assignment to create a training and they really wanted this to have a casual, relaxed feel. And so that's the vibe that you were using to create this. And this scenario, you come up with this scenario. And so I'll read it to you. And then when we get done here, I want us to discuss this a little bit. So we have Mike. Mike says this. Mike says, "Hey guys, I hope everyone had a great weekend. I'm excited to work with all of you. I know I'm a bit OCD, but I have prepared a color-coded agenda." Then Amy says, "Thanks so much for stepping up and leading the team, Mike." Then Mike says, "Our first order of business is to hire my replacement. I have an interview set up with Austin Smith tomorrow. Could someone take Austin on a tour?" Kara then says, "I can take him." So when you look at this scenario and this image on the screen, what bias do you see showing up here? What assumptions have been made? What bias is there? What identities are being centered here? And what identities are being forgotten here? Austin is a man, yes, right? Nowhere was that gender labeled that Austin was a man. I don't know if any of you haven't read, I'm sure some of you have, but I've got it right here. Austin Channing Brown's book, I'm Still Here, Black Dignity Made in a World of Whiteness. I recommend it. And she tells a really interesting story in her book about, her name's Austin, and she identifies as a woman. And that her parents gave her the name Austin so that when she submitted a resume and the name Austin was on the resume, that those interviewing would think she is a man and probably a white man. And just so she could get her foot in the door to get that interview. And so that's a great example here, right? We assume Austin is a man. I have a friend named Ryan who identifies as a woman, and often individuals think Ryan is a man. What else do we see here? Amy gave up the leadership role to Mike, right? Mike assumed he would be the lead, right? We've got a man in the leadership role, which is what often has been seen. What else do we have here? OCD. Yes, the use of the phrase OCD. This is a phrase we might often hear people say in jest, right? Like, I know I'm a bit OCD, or I know that's crazy, or I know that's insane. Like these phrases that are really problematic, right? This OCD is a diagnosis, and that phrase should not be used outside of the context in which it is meant for somebody who has been diagnosed with OCD. I found this quote on a blog that somebody who has been diagnosed with OCD, being obsessive compulsive disorder. And here's what this individual said. I just think it's really useful for us to understand the impact of when a phrase like this is used. It says, "Every single time someone says, 'I'm OCD,' I have that in quotation marks, it makes me doubt my own diagnosis and stops me from engaging in treatment." So let me repeat that. Every time someone says, "I'm so OCD," it makes me doubt my own diagnosis and stops me from engaging in treatment. So by that phrase being thrown around, somebody who is in treatment is now wondering if they should be in treatment. So just really the impact that a phrase like that can have. Oh, Amy, yeah, let me type the phrase or that book into the chat for you right now. I'm Still Here. Black. Right now. And while I'm typing this, I would love, what else do you notice about this scenario that's maybe problematic, where bias is showing up, identities that are being centered, being focused on, or identities or not? What else do you notice here? All right, there's the name of the book. Hey guys, yes, right. That is definitely problematic. The use of hey guys, right? Not everyone identifies as a guy. Such common language. I would say, again, it's really not really using a different phrase of hi all, hi team, hi folks, hi you all, like something else besides the use of the word guys. Let's see what else do we have here. Oh, the people in the photo are of all lighter skin tone. Yes, they are, right? This photo does not show much diversity. It may be difficult to see, but the woman here towards the back of the photo does have brown skin. And sometimes I've had individuals look at this photo and say, oh, well, we do have someone of color in this photo. And my response to that is really this photo to me, when you only have one person who has brown or black skin, really is tokenizing, right? It is really tokenizing the one person. It really feels like you're just trying to check, and I'm putting this in quotation marks, the diversity box, right? Like we are not authentically, fully representing um, um, people of black and brown skin, right? We are not doing this in an authentic way. And so really this notion, I often see what feels like to me tokenizing happening sometimes in images. Well, we want to make sure we have some individuals of color, but they're not giving a prominent role, they're not being portrayed positively, they're sort of like the sub characters in the story, so to speak. Let's see here. Something else, if you have other things, please put these in the chat. Some other things that I noticed is the use of the use of the names are all very Anglo-Saxon names with Mike and Amy and Kara. Um, very Anglo-Saxon names, not a lot of diversity there in terms of names. Let's see here. I also think the photo doesn't show a lot of body size, right? A lot of range in body sizes and body types also feels like is missing from this photo. All right, let's look at another example. Oh, before we move into the other example, really like this cartoon by Nia Lee, and it's titled Representation. I think this really hits home the importance of representing lots of identities in the work and the trainings that we create. So on the left-hand side, a child that appears to be white says, "Why do you draw so many black characters?" And then on the right, a child that is black, has black or brown skin says, because no one else will. And so I really think this hits home just how important I'm really thinking about representation and representing lots of identities in the work we do and how important that is. Here's another example. So this example is at the beginning of an instructor-led training. And so the facilitator, the instructor of this training is really wanting to create a lot of conversation. And so at the beginning of the training is really trying to present something in an engaging way to really get the audience chatting right off the bat. And so they open this up. The facilitator says, all right, I want you to go to the website on the screen and type in the code and then share where is the best place you have traveled to. So with this example, what is it that you notice that is problematic about the example? What bias do you see that is showing up in this training example? So please go ahead and put that in the chat. What bias do you see showing up here? Right. Yes. Travel or the financial means to do so, right? That's immediately like we're assuming that someone has the ability to travel, right? That all of the learners in this room, right, have the ability to travel. We are also assuming that everyone can see the screen, right? Like I didn't read the website and the code. Around this. I also think something else I also notice about this is that we are also assuming that everyone has access to a phone. that's got data on it to go to a website to be able to participate in this activity. So I think it's just a word of caution when we're designing experiences like this. Do we know what technology the learners have access to? Well, do they, if the company isn't providing a cell phone that they can use or a computer in this training, then, perhaps not using this. We can't assume that everyone has access to the technology, to a cell phone in which to participate. I see the question here. What would be a better question? What I think is, we got a response here, is what's the most interesting thing you learned this week? I often say, ask a question like this. What is something that brings you joy? I really try to think of a question that really you don't, again, have to have financial means. You shouldn't have to have done something in which to be able to answer it. So just thinking about those things. Awesome. All right. So in these, I'm sorry, I wanted to, the other comment back here. Let me move back. I meant to mention this, was the notion of color contrast. Yes, that's another great point to pick up here. Thank you for that too. All right. So in these past two scenarios, the individual designing this training, right, may not have intended to leave anyone out, right? Their intent may not have been to exclude individuals. However, the impact was that we did, right? So in the last example, if someone doesn't have a cell phone in which to participate in answering that question, then they did not get to engage in that activity. They weren't able to authentically participate and fully engage in that activity. And so they were left out, they were excluded. So sometimes, our intent may not be to exclude, but the impact is that we did. So for example, outside of the training context, the other day, one of my kids left their shoes at the bottom of the stairs. I'm an early riser, and so when I get up early in the morning, the house is dark, and I try not to turn on lights so I don't wake everybody up. But of course, since the shoes were left at the bottom of the stairs, I tripped over them and fell and bruised my leg. So my kid's intent was not to make me fall and bruise my leg, but the impact was that I did, and it hurt. And so the same thing can be said for the trainings that we create, right? Like we may not intend to exclude someone, but the impact is that we did it, right? Our positive intent doesn't necessarily take away the pain; it still hurt. And so, really, the impact of our unconscious bias is really often shows up in the form of microaggressions. So Dr. Darragh Sue is there's really a person who studies microaggressions, and he defines them as everyday slights, put downs, and insults. So microaggressions, while on the surface it may seem small, their impact is not because of the frequency in which they occur. Individuals from a marginalized group can experience microaggressions on a daily basis. And so there's really nothing micro about a microaggression. So here are what some of the impacts of microaggressions look like. So from a physical health and a mental health perspective, microaggressions can really lead to an increase in depression, a prolonged stress and trauma, high blood pressure, and poor sleep. From a career perspective, in a study that was recently done in the past couple of years, it was found that half of workers will consider leaving their jobs because of the daily microaggressions that they're experiencing. Another study was done, and this was done when lots of the conversations in 2021, when they were talking about our individuals, when are they going to come back physically to work in the office. And there was a study done that showed only 3% of Black professionals wanted to actually return to work in the office. And the reason for this is because of the depth and breadth of the microaggressions that were occurring on a daily basis in the workplace. Really, the psychological harm that was being felt. One of the pieces and reason why if Black employees were like, I feel like when I'm at home, I don't have to experience these microaggressions in the same way. I have more control of my space, and I can control more what is happening to me. And they said their ability to have a flexible working arrangement, it was a 64% boost in Black professionals' ability to manage stress, 25% improvement in their work-life balance, and it doubled the increase in their sense of belonging at work. Doubled the increase of their sense of belonging at work if they could remain and have a flexible working arrangement and not necessarily have to be back in the office because of the experiences they had with their fellow coworkers. Another study that was done, this was done in relation to the Great Resignation and trying to understand why individuals, were leaving the workplace or changing jobs in such large numbers. And what they found in this study is the number one reason for this turnover was because of a toxic corporate culture. But when you dive further into what is a toxic work culture, what they found is that the leading element contributing to a toxic work culture was failure to promote diversity, equity, inclusion, and workers feeling disrespected. And so that was the highest contributor to individuals leaving the workplace and to what we now have called the Great Resignation. So with that, wanted to chat a little bit about, given what we talked about, what our identities are, and how our bias shows up, and really the impact of those biases in the form of microaggressions. Why is this work important to learning and development? So I'd love for you to put in the chat your thoughts. Like, why are we here today? Why do we have a whole conference organized around this thought? Why is this work really important to learning and development? What role do we play in this? So I'd love for you to add in your thoughts to the chat around that question. For me, one of the reasons why this is so important for learning and development is that we really want, right? We want all of our learners to feel seen and to be represented in the training we create. We want all our learners to have, our learners can have different experiences in the training we create given their identities. And so I think it's really important that, we create training that where everyone feels seen, everyone feels represented, and everyone feels included, knowing the other places in which that may not be occurring in the workplace. I also think if we want our learners to gain skills, the training and our training contains microaggressions, they're not going to gain the skills that we want, right? It's just truly caring about humanity. So with that, this is a quote by Brene Brown that I really think helps ground this work and to really think about this. In order to empathize with someone else's experience, you must be willing to believe them as they see it and not imagine their experience to how you imagine their experience to be. And so for me, this quote really grounds my work and helps me to think about what are someone else's experience and believing them and honoring that experience and ensuring I honor that in the work that I do. So with that, what are some next steps? And some of these have been mentioned already throughout the past couple of days together. But what I would say is our action steps is to really ask questions as we are developing training, like asking the question of who's being centered in the training, who is being left out of the training you're creating, what identities are not being represented, how is your training reinforcing problematic stereotypes? Asking yourself those questions, stepping back from your work and asking those questions. I also think it's to keep learning about those who are different from your own. I believe Kayleen shared this yesterday, and I couldn't agree more of, we think back to that list of social identities, like you're not going to be able to have a lived experience for all of those different identities. But those identities are showing up for all of our learners. And so we need to learn about all of these different identities. And I think one of the great ways to do this is through memoirs, is reading someone else's story, to really give you perspective on others. I also agree and love the idea of following others on social media. Maybe if you don't hold that identity, it's not a place for you to jump into the conversation, but to really learn and to listen. So I think the more we can keep learning and asking some really hard questions of the work that we do to ensure it is inclusive, I think is really important to help sure all of our learners feel a sense of belonging. So with that, that's what I have. So if anyone has any questions or comments or thoughts, would love to hear of it. Thank you so much for your active contributions today.
All right, let's see. I'm not seeing anything in the Q area, but Erin, I would actually like to learn more about your journey into this field and being able to discuss this topic. How did you go about wanting to specialize in this?
Yeah, for sure. Well, as I mentioned, I grew up in an Appalachian background, and so when I got to college, I was for the first time around a lot of folks who were different than me. And I realized, and so my social class became really salient for me as something that was, other my peers could navigate the college experience in a way that I was not able to. They had different experiences than I did, language that I did. And then for the first time when I was in college, I was in relationships with folks who had different identities than me. And that is really what spurred my work and understanding of learning more about folks who were different than who I am. And so it was through those relationships. And it's been, no matter what I've done in my career, it has been part of the work that I have done and what I've tried to champion and advocate, and others, even where I spend a lot of my volunteer time. So it was really my own lived experiences and relationships with others that propelled me into doing this work.
What do you think is okay? Because you have the action steps here, but is there anything in particular for you personally that really kind of worked well for you to start, to learn more about this? I know asking questions, keep learning, but what did you join any groups, or I know you mentioned social media. What has really worked for you to expand your knowledge?
Much of what I've just said, it is the relationships I've formed with folks who have different identities than me, in really having those conversations with them and understanding the experiences that they've had, which then really leads me to all of like what I seek out, right? All of the books that I read are, I'm very intentional about that, of like understanding and learning from folks who have an experience different than my own, and how can I better advocate and support and include others. And so my bookshelves here are truly filled with books, and I of all sorts of folks who have a different experience than I have had.
I'm really curious too. You're as an independent consultant and doing this kind of work. What is that like?
Yeah, well, what I do is to all of the, you know, training that I create, this is always the questions that I'm asking. So in working with a client, with whatever the content is, to me, this shows up, right? And so it is what I work really hard to design trainings that are inclusive, but then are having those a tough conversation with a client if they want to approach something in a different way. And I'm really really try to bring, like, well, why could that be problematic, or how could that be leaving someone out if we approach it in this way. So it's really, as I'm working with different folks, is really like part of the conversation, no matter what the content of the training is about. It's, maybe not, it's not a DEI training specifically, but really how do we ensure all of those learners feel included and feel a sense of belonging in the training that we create. And so those are always the conversations that I'm having.
Nice. And I want to ask you the one question that really stuck out to me yesterday in Bridget's session, which is it was from Christy Tucker. Have you ever had to deal with SMEs or stakeholders who didn't want to make changes to remove bias, or were they resistant? And how did you handle it? Is that something that you've come across?
For sure. And that's where this microaggression conversation to me comes about, and really that intent versus impact. And really sharing some of that information is often how I approach that conversation. This is the impact of what happens when we don't include whatever into the training. And typically that intent versus impact is a way I have been able to help folks to open their eyes or get them to see, because sometimes they are coming in for, but like, that's not what we meant, we didn't intend to do that. But that has been a way that folks have sort of opened their mind and been willing to expand that and to include and expand the work that they do and include others into the training, is that intent versus impact conversation.
Interesting. Very cool. Thank you so much. All right, let me see. I'm just checking to see anybody. If you have any questions at all, please throw them in chat, or you can put them in the Q&A area. Otherwise, this was such an informative session, Erin. I so appreciate you taking the time to do this. All right, here we go. We have one from Sylvia. Are there tools you use to check inclusiveness?
Yes, there is. I use lots of, I've created, and I really hesitate to say checklist because I don't think this work is a checklist work, but really a tool that helps me go back and take a 50,000-foot view of what I have done, and to ensure like what identities are represented, what identities are not represented. Something else that I often like to do and will suggest to others is to really form a group of individuals who can really also help look at the training. So again, you only have your own lived experience, and your bias can still show up even though you don't. We talked about how prevalent unconscious bias is, even though you don't want it to. So really, when you can bring others into the fold, and often, we'll do that within a team setting, right? Let's getting some other folks, who are involved to help look at the work and see, what do they notice, what are they noticing, what is happening, what's not happening. Obviously, I think that's really important, that this is something, if folks aren't particularly doing L&D work, you just don't go out and solicit folks from a marginalized identity to do this work. But folks who want to and get involved in would totally recommend that.
Yeah, like Sylvia added like a soundboard or sounding board. And that's the first time I've heard that. I think that is a great point. How do you, so like your group that you might go to, where did you find them?
It's other folks who do this work, right? And they've
Okay.
got different identities than I have, and so we help support each other in this work. I think for a company, you could have folks who are passionate, who want to do this and see this from a different lens, is also a really important way. Again, I think those have to be put together in a really careful, intentional way, that
Mhm.
folks that need to volunteer and want to do this. So we're not tokenizing someone because they have a certain identity, but if done right, I think can really help others. And I
That's great.
apologize. I'm seeing now, like, my chat was slow, and now I'm seeing there are more comments in the chat. So I apologize earlier if I didn't acknowledge someone's comments. Things are now in my chat that were there 10 minutes ago, and I'm just now seeing. So
Yeah, like that, the idea of having that kind of sounding board, I wish that there were a way. I'll have to think about that, or if anybody has any ideas of how TLDC as a community might be able to provide opportunities for that, I would definitely support that, because I think that is an excellent idea. Um, let's see. And with that, I think that's it. I'm not seeing any other questions. Erin, thank you so much for doing this. Really appreciate you being a part of the event. It fantastic session. I can't wait to go back and watch the recording. I want to mention something else just real quick. Erin had mentioned Kayleen Holt, and I locked her inclusive learning pledge on the top of the event feed. So if you go up to feed at the top of your screen, you'll see a link to her inclusive learning pledge. That if you don't know about it, take a look at that page. And if you are at all aligned with the core values of it, anything, feel free to just add your name to it. I think it's a fantastic idea, and Kayleen is such a champion of this entire effort. So keep that in mind. I've locked that up there. And with that, Erin, if people want to reach out to you or get in touch with you, what's the best way to do that?
Yeah, the best way would be to go to LinkedIn and just search for me, Erin Huffman-Richard.
Excellent. All right, great. Oh, and Vanessa's in. Thanks for being here, Vanessa. All right, everybody, I'm going to close this out. I got a message from Lisa Spurko, who was going to do the PowerPoint session today, but she's sick. She actually has like bronchitis, and so not going to be able to do that session coming up. Hopefully we'll be able to reschedule that one soon so that we can make sure that we add it to this event. So for today, Erin is the only session that we've got. Tomorrow we've got Sudeep Mohandas, who is absolutely incredible. Please show up for that one. I was working on some of the videos and things that he has integrated into his presentation tomorrow, and it's really incredible stuff. So join us tomorrow for that one. And with that, I'm going to go ahead and close out the session. Thanks again, Erin. Thanks for everybody for being here. And hopefully we'll see you tomorrow. Bye, everybody.